when the conflict between Russia and Ukraine intensified into a larger scale war, the ensuing global distress and instability have had a profound and far-reaching impact that cannot be overstated. The conflict has injected a profound sense of uncertainty and turmoil into the heart of Europe. It has severely strained an international system already grappling with numerous fault lines and challenges across all continents. Despite the substantial resources allocated by this Council to address the issue, the conflict appears to be veering towards a gloomy direction, with the severity of consequences escalating ominously. In light of the severe humanitarian, political, and economic consequences of the conflict, coupled with the genuine risk of a nuclear deflagration by accident, miscalculation, or otherwise, we believe a significant course adjustment is necessary, with the diplomacy assuming a central role. It is our understanding that for diplomacy to bear fruit, all parties must overcome the limitations of the current approach based solely on confrontation and use of force. In this context, it is our collective duty as representatives of our states to strongly encourage a negotiated settlement of the conflict in accordance with the charter that guides our organization. As we navigate through bloody conflicts in Africa, Middle East, and Asia, it is crucial that we bear in mind the interconnected nature of global peace and security. We do believe peace and security are indivisible and are of interest to the entire humankind. Madam President, we remain convinced and have consistently maintained that responsible and genuine dialogue is the only viable means to resolve this conflict. Against this background, Mozambique firmly advocates a political and negotiated solution as the most viable way to end the conflict. This is the solid path for a lasting and sustainable peace between the two sister countries and the two neighboring countries. To achieve this, we urge the parties to cease hostilities without delay, to resume direct negotiations without preconditions, and engage in dialogue in good faith. The cause of peace compels us that we encourage the parties to return to the negotiating table and embrace the imperfections of a compromise in the name of peace and security in Ukraine, in Europe, and in the world. Mozambique will always support every effort towards silencing the guns in Ukraine. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you for convening this meeting. My thanks go also to the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, for his insightful briefing. 2 years have passed since the crisis in Ukraine started, and hopes of reaching sustaining peace remain unattainable. The continuing deterioration of the humanitarian situation and the impact of the ongoing hostilities on civilians are a source of serious concern for Algeria, who had very friendly relations with both countries. The loss of civilian lives, the suffering of refugees and internally displaced persons caused by this conflict are profoundly worrying. Critical infrastructure, such as energy facilities and agri-food system, were heavily impacted, with significant consequences felt worldwide, notably in Africa and developing countries. In the face of these challenges, the Council, whose primary responsibility is the maintenance of international peace and security, failed to pave the way for any consensual way out to the crisis. From day one at this Council, we have repeatedly expressed our concern about all the violations of international law, including international humanitarian law. We often stressed that continued escalation is neither beneficial nor granting peace to any of the parties. The polarization is only exacerbating tensions and jeopardizing prospects for sustainable peace. Madam President, today I would like to focus on what we didn't witness during these 2 years, or I should say what we wish to see in the nearest future. First, it is high time to deploy the necessary diplomatic effort to achieve de-escalation of tension between the parties so that we can put an end as soon as possible to the loss of lives and people suffering. Second, the concerned parties must show their willingness and readiness to engage in an inclusive and constructive dialogue. The two parties need to be guided by the spirit of good faith and without preconditions towards a peaceful settlement of this dispute within the implementation of the international law and the international humanitarian law. Third, we urge the parties to agree on a just and a lasting peace based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and their legitimate security concerns. 4, we emphasize the need to ensure a more coordinated and harmonized diplomatic action among the international community. The noble objective here will be to bring together the concerned parties and guarantee a more efficient and comprehensive diplomatic process to end this crisis. Obviously, political will is key to achieve tangible progress and mutually acceptable solution. Equally important is the consistency of this Council in upholding its responsibility in the protection of civilians, implementing the international humanitarian law, and the principles and purposes of the UN Charter. Yes, all the pillars of the Charter. For its part, Algeria will remain actively engaged in the Security Council to promote a peaceful and a political solution to this crisis. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Madam President, I thank you for convening this briefing. I also thank the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, for his very informative briefing. Tomorrow, the 24th of February 2024, will mark exactly 2 years since the start of the conflict in Ukraine. The war has had profound repercussions that have gone beyond regional boundaries. This conflict has been protracted to the extent that the prospects for a peaceful settlement between Russia and Ukraine remains elusive, with both countries continuing to rely on military means to influence the war's outcome. There is thus a seeming stalemate with devastating consequences for civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, and far-reaching effects on the geopolitical landscape and global economy. In the 2 years of the brutal conflict, more than 47,000 incidents involving armed clashes, airstrikes, and other attacks occurred across Ukraine in 2023 alone. These incidents caused increased civilian deaths, widespread damage, and destruction of homes, schools, hospitals, and other vital civil infrastructure, including energy. The cost of the conflict has been excessively high. According to the OHCHR, civilian casualties in Ukraine have exceeded 30,000, with over 10,000 killed and 19,000 injured since the full-scale conflict. It is believed that the actual figures are considerably higher. The International Organization for Migration has reported that the destruction of residential buildings has left nearly 720,000 people in the worst-affected parts of Ukraine with no access to adequate and safe housing. In Kherson Oblast, for example, nearly 30% of people live in damaged buildings. Access to education remains highly constrained, with almost half of all educational institutions damaged or destroyed in Kharkiv and Kherson, and the staggering 80% in Donetsk, according to the Ministry of Education and humanitarian partners. Access to health has also been impacted, with over 1,500 attacks on healthcare facilities verified by the WHO since February 2022. Nearly half of health centers are now rendered non-functional in some parts of the East and South. Sierra Leone condemns all attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure and emphasizes that these attacks are prohibited under international law. We call on all sides to comply with applicable international law, in particular international humanitarian law. Madam President, the distressing attack against civilians and civilian infrastructure have caused the fastest growing and largest displacement crisis in Europe. The UNHCR approximates that 10 million people have been forcibly displaced by the war as at last month, including 3.7 million internally displaced people and 6.3 million refugees who have fled Ukraine for abroad. As at the end of 2023, 5.9 million refugees from Ukraine were recorded across Europe. OCHA estimates that there are now over 14.6 million people in dire need of humanitarian assistance, including the 10 including the approximately 10 million forcibly displaced people. About 3.3 million people living in frontline communities are grappling with severe shortages of resources and constant bombardment. Children have not been spared from the brunt and brutality of the conflict. Allegations of gross violation of the protection measures for children during armed conflicts have been reported. Destruction of healthcare facilities have exposed millions to increased trauma and mental health issues and impacted children's well-being. Additionally, the attacks on schools have had a significant impact on educational activities. Reportedly, across the country, only 1/3 of children are attending classes entirely in person, while 1/3 are learning through a mixed in-person and online approach, and another 1/3 are fully learning online. In view of the above, Sierra Leone commends humanitarian aid agencies for considerably expanding the humanitarian operations over the past 2 years to respond to the growing and deteriorating needs that follow the escalation of the conflict. As hostilities along the front line continue to hamper humanitarian organizations' ability to deliver aid and services to people impacted by the conflict, Sierra Leone urges parties to the conflict to allow unhindered access of humanitarian personnel to people in dire need. Madam President, the economic ramifications of the war have been keenly felt across the global landscape, particularly in the food and energy markets, trade dynamics, and supply chain disruptions. These disruptions have contributed to price hikes and supply shortages that have reverberated across sectors reliant on stable market prices. In view of the economic challenges, Sierra Leone emphasizes the importance of the resolution of the conflict to enable the recovery and stabilization of not only the region, but the wider world. By supporting efforts to stabilize energy markets, restore trade networks, and provide economic assistance to affected populations, we can mitigate the economic impact of the conflict and pave the way for sustainable economic growth and development in the region and beyond. Moreover, the conflict has strained global political and economic relations and heightened geopolitical tensions, with serious implications for international cooperation on critical socio-economic and development issues, in addition to the maintenance of international peace and security. The erosion of trust and cooperation between nations has also exacerbated critical global issues such as arms control, nuclear proliferation, cybersecurity, and trade agreements, posing additional challenges for the maintenance of international peace and security. As we navigate the complexities of the Russia-Ukraine conflict and its multidimensional global repercussions, Sierra Leone once more calls for good faith diplomatic efforts in pursuit of a peaceful resolution. Meaningful steps must be taken towards the immediate cessation of the hostilities and parties to the conflict to engage constructively, including on their legitimate concerns, to find a political and diplomatic solution as envisaged in Article 33 of the UN Charter. Let me close, Madam President, by noting that based on our unwavering principled view on the sacrosanct nature of the UN Charter, principles of respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of member states, we once more reiterate our call for the full respect of the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for his statement, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Guyana. Secretary General, I thank you for your briefing and indeed for all you do in trying to forge peace in our world. I also wish to acknowledge the presence of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, all other ministers and high-level officials joining this meeting. Tomorrow will mark exactly 2 years since Russian military forces invaded the territory of Ukraine in what was then termed a special military operation, an action that has cost the lives of over 10,000 civilians, injured many more, and displaced over 6 million Ukrainians. The toll on civilians in both Ukraine and Russia, including women, children, the elderly, and persons living with disabilities is exceedingly high, with no immediate end in sight. Excellencies, Russia's invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago violated the most basic tenets of the United Nations Charter and the principles of respect for territorial integrity, sovereignty, and non-interference. Our countries have all felt the impact of this war to some degree, not only in terms of increased challenges to the rules-based order as we know it, anchored in the Charter and international law, but also in terms of disruptions in food and energy prices, logistics and supply chains, and worsening hunger in the most vulnerable regions of the globe, already struggling amidst COVID-19 recovery efforts. As a small developing state whose sovereignty and territorial integrity are protected by legal norms and instruments, Guyana deplores the threat or use of force in the conduct of international relations and condemns the military aggression that has been unleashed against the people of Ukraine. We reiterate our call for an immediate cessation of hostilities and a return to diplomacy. War must never be the answer. Instead, dialogue and diplomacy are the only guarantees of achieving lasting peace. While we welcome and recognize the efforts of some UN member states to find a diplomatic solution, we encourage greater investments in this regard. We call on the parties to respect the principles of distinction, precaution, and proportionality, and to fully comply with their legal obligations, including under the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols. It is regrettable that this Council, which has the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, is still unable to find a meaningful solution to end the conflict and to minimize the full impact of the war on the erosion of international norms. We repeat our call for the complete withdrawal of Russian military forces from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine and urge the parties to commit to a serious political and diplomatic process toward ending the conflict. We also urge strengthened efforts at all levels by all concerned parties toward a peaceful resolution. Guyana stands ready to work with members of this Council, and in fact everyone, to bring the war in Ukraine to a peaceful end and to find a sustainable solution for long-lasting peace. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Dmytro Kuleba, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam President. As we discuss the war and peace talks and negotiations, here today there is another air raid on Ukraine taking place right now. And a residential building in Odessa was hit less than an hour ago. 2 civilians are heavily wounded, delivered to the hospital. And I'm afraid that someone is going to die in Ukraine before this meeting is adjourned. Because talking about negotiations is one thing, but throwing more drones and missiles on Ukraine, as Russia does every day, is completely another thing. But first of all, allow me to thank Secretary General for his attendance and his briefing. And also, of course, my thanks go to Guyanese presidency for convening us today. 2 years since Russia started its full-scale military invasion, 10 years since it started its aggression by attempting to annex Ukrainian Crimea and launching war in the Donetsk and Lugansk regions. Today, Russia's name is synonymous with aggression, war, crimes, and barbarism. Its ugly face is the direct result of its impunity, stemming first and foremost from its presence in this chamber's seat. This is the seat of the Soviet Union, a state that does not exist anymore, and it has never been legally transferred to the Russian Federation. This is an example of how a small fraud led to a global catastrophe. We continue to insist that Russia has no legal right to be present at this table, and the future reform should correct this historic mistake that led to deadly consequences. Putin's regime, which has been in place for around 24 years now, has already ruined millions of lives. During this time, Moscow launched or joined at least 3 major wars in Georgia, Ukraine, and Syria, which is approximately 1 war every 8 years. It also stands behind the attempted coup in Montenegro and destabilizing efforts in the Sahel region. And the scariest thing is that we must now focus not only on the lives already taken by Russia, but also on the lives that it is prepared to take in the future. Russia acted every time this council failed to act. For every word uttered in this room, Russia took a real human life. And it's happening right now. It continues to happen. And it is only through our resolute and joint actions that we can put the aggressor in its place and restore international peace and security. We do believe in the United Nations and the UN Charter, and we do applaud the tireless efforts of the responsible members of this Council. Colleagues, Russian propaganda is now trumpeting what they call the liberation of Avdiivka. Well, what we see in Avdiivka right now is the liberation à la Russe. Russia fully liberated the city of its people, buildings, and life. It dropped hundreds of guided aerial bombs, each with a warhead weighing 250 or 500 kilograms. Hundreds of bombs, each is carrying 250 or 500 kilograms of explosive. Google and see a hole this bomb leaves when it hits the building, the house, hospital. The streets of Avdiivka are literally covered with the corpses of Russian soldiers killed in the so-called meat assaults. This is not how we call them. This is how they, the Russians themselves, call this barbaric war tactic. They sent their own people into meat assaults. Conquer at any cost. This is their strategy. Russia has paid for the ruins of Avdiivka with the lives of at least 17,000 Russian soldiers since October 2023. This is more casualties in a few months than in 10 years of the Soviet war in Afghanistan. Immediately after occupying the city, the Russians committed new war crimes there. As confirmed by footage circulated by Russian propaganda itself, at least 5 Ukrainian prisoners of war, heavily wounded, were killed by the Russians. Justice must be served to all victims of Russian crimes, and we continue to work on holding Russia accountable. We categorically reject any Russian attempts to evade responsibility, including by spreading lies about the recent International Court of Justice ruling on January 31st. Our detailed letter outlining Ukraine's position was distributed in the Council a few days ago. There is no more important task for everyone present in this room than to realize that there are other cities outside Ukraine that can become Avdiivka if the Russian imperial conquest is not stopped. On the eve of the invasion 2 years ago, I warned that no nation would be able to sit out the crisis that was about to begin. And this is what happened. So please, to those who did not hear me 2 years ago, hear me today. Either we stop Russia in Ukraine now by expelling the invaders, or we will face a fire in other parts of the world that will claim millions of lives. And when future generations look back at this moment in time and read the records of our meetings, they will wonder why the world failed to act in such an obvious case of one country shattering the entire international peace and security. And they will ask us, why were they not able to stop it? We can restore peace if we act together in a resolute and principled manner. But instead of watching Moscow create problems and inviting others to solve them, which is the usual Russian strategy, we must push Russia back, because Russia itself is the problem, the global problem. Madam President, while we gather here, the situation on the front lines remains tense as Russia stops at nothing to bring more death and destruction to Ukraine. Russia still hopes for our divisions, perplexity, and indecisiveness, which would weaken international solidarity and military assistance to Ukraine. Intensifying missile terror against civilians and civilian infrastructure also serves Russia's purpose. Moscow hopes that the world will deplete its empathy towards Ukrainians if Ukrainians are killed every single day for too many days in a row. We shall not allow this to happen. We will rally the world behind our true cause even more. Russian terror only strengthens our resilience and commitment. Please remember that more support to Ukraine means more opportunities for peace. Just and lasting peace based on the UN Charter and peace formula proposed by Ukraine. Ukraine wants peace more than any other nation. However, we are not going to allow Russia to kill us freely on the road to peace. Nor will we ever accept any offer to surrender or to concede our lands and freedoms under the guise of peace. Not only because it will make futile the ultimate price we are paying now for 2 years in a row, but also because we will all be doomed to pay a much higher price in the future. And if you genuinely wish to lower this price and give peace a chance, send us air defense to protect our civilians and ammunition to stop Russian army on our soil. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Kuleba, for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Xavier Bettel, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, and Minister for Development, Cooperation and Humanitarian Affairs of Luxembourg.
Merci Madame la Présidente. Encore une fois, Monsieur Nebensia quitte la salle quand on prend la parole. C'est difficile d'avoir un dialogue. Alors c'est ce qu'il avait demandé ce matin. Nous sommes aujourd'hui ici, et je peux juste de dire qu'il a dit qu'on était tous des fonctionnaires et des bureaucrates. J'ai été élu démocratiquement avec des partis d'opposition qui ont le droit de se présenter. Donc c'est juste aussi important de le rappeler pourquoi on est ici. Aussi 5 minutes pour expliquer pourquoi est-ce qu'on veut parler, tout simplement parce qu'il est important ici dans cette salle de rappeler les valeurs pour lesquelles, après la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, on a dit qu'on voulait construire quelque chose ensemble. Et qu'aujourd'hui, la Russie se trouve si isolée. Et qu'aujourd'hui, à part la Syrie, l'Iran, la Corée du Nord et peut-être la Biélorussie sont les grands supports, je me poserai des questions si ce sont les alliés les plus sûrs pour parler de valeurs démocratiques telles que l'ambassadeur a voulu le faire ce matin en Assemblée générale. La Russie est isolée. Quand on parle de nazis et qu'aujourd'hui l'Ukraine serait remplie de nazis et que la Russie serait presque en train de libérer l'Ukraine des nazis, c'est un affront par rapport aux Russes morts pendant la Deuxième Guerre mondiale qui se sont combattus contre les nazis. De les mettre tout simplement à ce niveau-là, de parler d'héros de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, oui, mais parler aujourd'hui de vouloir libérer des nazis, je pense que le comportement et les comparaisons, c'est réécrire l'histoire. Permettez-moi juste d'insister aussi sur cette opération militaire spéciale. Comme on dit toujours, c'est une opération militaire spéciale. Oui, elle est spéciale puisqu'elle est injustifiée, elle est criminelle, elle est spéciale parce qu'une opération militaire, normalement, a des justifications. Et si elle ne l'est pas, c'est pour ça qu'il la qualifie peut-être de spéciale. Mais je dois juste vous dire qu'aujourd'hui, moi, je fais partie d'une génération qui n'a pas connu la guerre. J'ai eu un voisin à l'époque qui était l'Allemagne. Aujourd'hui, c'est mon partenaire, c'est mon voisin, c'est mon ami. Je construis des choses avec eux. Et que de nos jours, la sécurité des jeunes dépend du voisin. Et j'ai certains pays aussi autour de la table, quand je vois la République de Corée, qui doivent se poser des questions le matin, quand on se réveille, ce que va penser un dictateur dans le nord du pays, ce qu'il va entreprendre. Il est triste pour des générations aujourd'hui de savoir que selon là où on est né, la sécurité n'est pas la même pour les uns ou pour les autres. Je ne parle pas d'autres conflits qu'il y a aujourd'hui qui ne sont pas à l'ordre du jour, mais où aussi on doit réfléchir aux chances que l'on veut donner aux jeunes. Et c'est pour ça que ceux qui n'ont pas encore signé le texte sur la protection des enfants à l'école, je le recommande de le faire, car si on les hypothèque aussi pour l'avenir, je pense qu'ils nous en voudront. Aujourd'hui, nous décidons de l'avenir de notre monde. Madame la Présidente, merci de m'avoir donné cette possibilité de prendre la parole. C'est un sujet qui me tient à cœur, moi-même ayant des origines russes et polonaises, et c'est triste aujourd'hui que beaucoup de Russes ont honte de leur nationalité, alors qu'avant c'était un pays qui était fier. Et j'aimerais que la Russie reconnaisse simplement les erreurs qu'ils aient faites. Il n'est jamais trop tard pour reconnaître les erreurs. Mais l'impunité aussi est quelque chose qui doit exister et qui doit aussi être la base de la règle internationale. En tout cas, de se retrouver dans cette salle ici avec les propos tenus et le fait d'avoir un ambassadeur qui quitte montre la volonté du dialogue de la Russie. On est dans une impasse, il faut qu'on prenne les mesures nécessaires.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Bettel for his statement, and I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Annalena Baerbock, Federal Minister for Foreign Affairs of Germany.
Madam President, as the representative of Russia asked why we Europeans are here today, I will tell you. Throughout my entire life, I've been lucky to live in peace in Europe, like millions of my generation. The reason why we are here today is because you, Russia, broke that peace in Europe. You broke our European peace order on our common shared continent. You broke the peace for millions of Ukrainians, men, children, and women. Women like Anastasia, a young mother who has lost her lower leg when she stepped on a Russian mine. She wants to return to the front as soon as she can. Like Oksana, who's a surgeon, who decided to operate on her own father when he was injured in Bucha. Like Julia, a teenager girl who I met in Kiev after she could be freed from her hostage in Russia, pleading to me, don't give in to Putin. When I think about the ruthless war of aggression that Russia has waged in Ukraine for 2 years now, I think about Anastasia, Oksana, Julia, and the bravery and resilience of millions of Ukrainians who know that if they end their defense of their country, Ukraine ends. Because they see what the brutal reality of Russian occupation means to their people in the eastern Ukrainian territories, where thousands of children have been deported like Julia to Russia, and where women, men are brutally raped, arrested, tortured. And yet, we heard again, we want to negotiate. But Putin is making clear every day, every hour, as we have heard right now, that he does not want to negotiate peace. He wants to complete his conquest. He has said it over and over again. Russia, a permanent member of this Security Council, wants a sovereign state to give up its right to exist. Where would we end up if this principle will prevail? As also the Secretary General has put surprisingly. Which of us would be the next country to be invaded by a ruthless neighbor? Whose children would be next to be abducted? Whose sons to be shot? Whose daughters to be raped? If we were to give in, that would be the end of the Charter, our Charter. Therefore, we will not cease our support for Ukraine. That's why the German government has just signed a bilateral security agreement that offers Ukraine reliable, long-term support. We stand with Ukraine as long as it takes, with men and women like Anastasia, Oksana, Julia, men and women who are defending their peace, our freedom, and our Charter of the United Nations. Thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Baerbock for her statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Radoslav Sikorski, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Poland.
Madam President, I associate myself with the words of Minister Kuleba of Ukraine and my colleagues from the European Union. But I am amazed at the tone and the content of the presentation by the Russian ambassador, and I thought I could be useful by correcting the record. Ambassador Nebendia has called Kiev the clients of the West. Actually, Kiev is fighting to be independent of anybody. He calls them a criminal Kiev regime. In fact, Ukraine has a democratically elected government. He calls them Nazis. Well, the president is Jewish, the defense minister is Muslim, and they have no political prisoners. He said that Ukraine was wallowing in corruption. Well, Alexei Navalny documented how honest and full of probity his own country is. He blamed the war on US neocolonialism. In fact, it is Russia that tried to exterminate Ukraine in the 19th century, again under the Bolsheviks, and it's the third attempt. He said that we are prisoners of Russophobia. Phobia means irrational fear. Yet we are being threatened almost every day by the former president of Russia and by Putin propagandists with nuclear annihilation. I put to you that it's not irrational. When Russia threatens us, we trust it. He said that we are denying Russia's security interests. Not true. We've only started rearming ourselves when Russia started invading her neighbors. He even said that Poland attacked Russia during World War II. What is he talking about? It's the Soviet Union that attacked Poland together with Nazi Germany on the 17th of September 1939. They even held a joint victory parade on the 22nd of September. He says that Russia has always only beaten back aggression. What were Russian troops doing at the gates of Warsaw in August 1920? They were on a topographical excursion? No, the truth is that for every time that Russia has been invaded, she has invaded 10 times. He says that this is a perfidious proxy war by the West. My advice is don't fall into the Western trap. Withdraw your troops to the international border and avoid this Western plot. He also says that there was an illegal coup in Ukraine, in Kiev in 2014. Well, I was there. There was no coup. President Yanukovych murdered 100 of his compatriots, and he was removed from office by a democratically elected Ukrainian parliament, including his own party, the Party of Regions. And finally, he is saying that we, the West, are somehow trying to persuade that Russia can never be beaten. Well, Russia didn't win the Crimean War, it didn't win the Russo-Japanese War, it didn't win World War I, it didn't win the Battle of Warsaw, it didn't win in Afghanistan, and it didn't win the Cold War. But there is good news. After each failure, there were reforms. Such demagoguery is unworthy of a member on a permanent basis of the Security Council. But what the ambassador has achieved is to remind us why we resisted Soviet domination and what Ukraine is resisting now. They failed to subjugate us then, they'll fail to subjugate Ukraine and us now. Thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Sikorski for his statement, and I will now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Gabrielis Landsbergis, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania.
Thank you, Madam President. I will speak on behalf of Czech Republic, Estonia, Latvia, and my own country, Lithuania. Today and tomorrow, many will yet again call on Russia to end its brutal war against Ukraine. Many will say that Russia's unprovoked aggression goes against everything these United Nations stand for. Some will question the credibility of this Council to defend the rules-based international order. But however loud, however eloquent we are, our protest and outrage will barely register in Moscow, and rockets will continue to rain down on Ukrainian homes, hospitals, and schools. Today we are facing choices that might well define the century, just as choices in the 1930s defined the previous century. Do we continue to appease the aggressor, who is patient and meticulous in his attempts to turn everything this organization holds dear into a mockery? Do we once again allow him to escape responsibility for his aggression? Do we continue to feed him with lives and land, misled by our fear of escalation and naive hopes that this time he will be fully satisfied? Today we come to this Council to address the entire international community with a very simple message. For all our sakes, wake up. If we fail, the rules-based order will crumble. Ukraine's sovereignty, Europe's security, as well as the success of the global efforts for human rights, accountability for food security, nuclear safety will all be in the hands of those who benefit from disruption and chaos. History reminds us of the terrible cost of the wrong choices. Hedging our bets earns us nothing but more war. Russia is being emboldened by our cautious response. We see it emboldened in Ukraine. We see it emboldened in Russia itself, eliminating any opposition in Russia, aiming to destroy any hope for a different Russia, normal, peaceful Russia. Equally, other revisionist powers across the world are already exploiting our indecisiveness. If not contained, this Kremlin-driven arc of instability will continue to expand, igniting more conflicts that we are not prepared to counter. Ukraine may seem far away, and the world's attention is divided, but it is imperative to realize that Russia's aggression against Ukraine ultimately impacts us all. This war must be won, and won decisively. It is not just Europe's war, it is a challenge to the international order, which, while imperfect, aims to ensure that law rather than military might determines our borders and sovereignty. The choices we make at these crossroads will define how we are remembered. We have the capacity to win, as Ukraine continues to make enormous sacrifices to stand against the ruthless aggressor. History reminds us of the cost of our past mistakes. We must also find a political will to come up with an adequate legal response to Russia's illegal war of territorial conquest. Russia's leadership must bear full responsibility for the aggression launched by Vladimir Putin, else impunity will continue. Madam President, I would like to remind all those here today that our three Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, have been occupied, colonized and exploited by the exactly same aggressor more than once. More than once. And that is why we know from bitter experience that whatever words are spoken, whatever agreements are signed, this aggressor has no plans to stop until he is stopped. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Landsbergis, for his statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Gordon Grilic Radman, Minister for Foreign and European Affairs of Croatia.
Many of us addressed this Council a year ago, calling on Russia to cease its illegal aggression against Ukraine. Yet we are meeting in this chamber again today. Regrettably, marking 2 years since the beginning of Russia's military aggression against Ukraine and 10 years since the illegal annexation of Crimea. Russia's aggression against Ukraine is a blatant violation of international law and the UN Charter, affecting both regional and global security, including the pillars of nuclear safety and security. To date, countless lives have been needlessly lost in this war, including tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians killed. For this, there needs to be accountability, not only because accountability provides justice to the victims, but also because it helps prevent future atrocities. Yet instead of ending this senseless war, Russia is intensifying it. Russia's actions have put entire societies around the world at risk by exposing them to food insecurity and energy shortages. We urge Russia to respect ICJ's preliminary measures, cease all attacks, particularly those affecting civilians and causing damage to civilian infrastructure, and to comply with the resolutions of this chamber and with the values and principles enshrined in the UN Charter. Madam President, we reaffirm our unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity, as we have seen the beginning of this aggression. Croatia provided and continues to provide aid to Ukraine with urgent and humanitarian assistance alone amounting to almost 60 million euros, and over 25,000 Ukrainians have found temporary protection in Croatia. Recognizing from our own experience the costs and threats coming from mine contamination, Croatia hosted in Zagreb the first ever high-level international donors conference on humanitarian demining in Ukraine in October 2023. This conference, co-organized by the governments of Croatia and Ukraine, confirmed support to Ukraine's demining efforts by 34 participating countries, pledging €500 million overall. Finally, Madam President, we call on Russia to withdraw its troops from Ukraine's internationally recognized borders, cease its illegal procurement of arms and ammunition, and uphold its responsibilities as a member of this organization as well as a permanent member of this Council. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Grilic Radman for his statement, and I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Hanke Bruins-Slot, Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm here today on behalf of the Group of Friends of Accountability following the aggression against Ukraine, a group of 49 member states and the European Union. We share a strong conviction. We don't accept that might makes right. And so it is with heavy hearts that we continue to witness Russia's unwarranted, unprovoked, and illegal war in Ukraine. Time again, the UN member states have underlined the need for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. Yet Russia has turned a deaf ear to these pleas. As firm believers in right over might, we cannot look away. We must do our utmost to hold Russia and those responsible to account for crimes committed in and against Ukraine. We commend the efforts and initiatives already taken so far, such as the ongoing work of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission, the Commission of Inquiry established by the Human Rights Council, and SRSG's patents team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence. We also continue to support the Ukrainian Prosecutor General, the work carried out by the International Criminal Court, the International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression, and the Register of Damage for Ukraine. Because we are all working towards one goal, ensuring accountability for the most serious crimes committed on Ukrainian territory and against the Ukrainian people. Madam President, Russia's act of aggression violates the UN Charter. As parties to this Charter, there's only one way we can respond. This cannot stand. Therefore, we reiterate our call on the Russian Federation to comply with its international obligations. We will never stop calling for this. We will keep demanding Russia withdraw all of its forces and respect the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Ukraine within its international recognized borders. We will never stop supporting the people of Ukraine. Thank you, Madam President.
Her Excellency Ms. Bruins-Slot for her statement, and I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Helena Carreiras, Minister of National Defense of Portugal.
Thank you, Madam President. I welcome the opportunity to address the Security Council on the situation in Ukraine. As Russia's illegal and unprovoked full-scale invasion enters its third year, and as the Ukrainian territories of Crimea and the Donbass reach a full decade under Russian illegal occupation, we cannot and will not fail to reiterate our resolute condemnation of these blatant violations of international law. This war not only jeopardizes the foundations of international security, it has also sent shockwaves around the world, disrupting global food and energy markets and affecting particularly the most vulnerable countries. Ukraine can continue to count on Portugal's full and unwavering support, both bilaterally and collectively within every multilateral framework, including here at the United Nations. From day one, we have been unequivocal about where we stand, side by side with Ukraine. The value of our commitments can only be measured by the consistency of our actions. In addition to our political support, Portugal has provided military support and humanitarian aid. In all these efforts, we have consistently responded to the calls of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian armed forces, bearing in mind our shared commitment towards restoring peace and security in Europe. And it is not only the government, but also the citizens of Portugal that strongly support this effort, even though we are geographically so far away. Ultimately, the goal is one and the same: to defend and uphold the rules, principles, and values that are enshrined in the United Nations Charter. This only can happen with a just and sustainable solution that is in accordance with the Charter and with Ukraine's peace formula, and that holds accountable those responsible for the ongoing atrocities. We therefore call on Russia to cease all operations, retreat from Ukraine, and respect international law. Together, united, we will prevail in supporting Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Carreras for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Bujar Osmani, Minister for Foreign Affairs of North Macedonia.
Thank you so much, Madam President, Excellencies. I thank the UN Secretary General for his briefing on Ukraine. Tomorrow will mark 2 years since the Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a blatant violation of the Charter of the United Nations and international law. North Macedonia strongly condemned and further condemns and renounces the decision of Moscow to opt the path of war, a clear act of aggression against an independent country. And we urge Russia once again to end this senseless war and withdraw its troops from the sovereign territory of Ukraine. This is the only way to restore peace and to create the conditions to further diplomatic engagement for a just and sustainable solution in line with the international law and the full respect of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. We recall the adoption of last year's important UNGA resolution, and my country joined the other 140 member states in a common endeavor to restore peace, to safeguard the rule-based international order, as well as to reaffirm our firm and unequivocal support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders as of 1991. We deplore the Russian Federation's failure to observe it. Madam President, during these 2 years, the people of Ukraine have shown resilience and extraordinary courage in their fight for their freedom, independence, mere existence, and are just simply defending themselves, all of which are in line with Article 51 of the UN Charter. And every day we continue to hear reports of more civilian deaths, destruction and suffering, especially in the communities near the active conflict zone in eastern and southern Ukraine, and call for an end and on all attacks on critical infrastructures, including schools, hospitals, energy, water and sanitation systems. Justice and accountability must prevail. And accountability is not an objective per se, it is an indispensable tool to secure peace, stability and security, and the most effective instrument to avoid this happening again to another sovereign state, to another nation. We reiterate the importance of investigating the war crimes on the territory of Ukraine in order to bring the perpetrators to justice and other crimes, including the crime of aggression, in accordance with international law, in particular the International Criminal Court, and support the creation of a special tribunal regarding the crime of aggression against Ukraine. And North Macedonia will continue to engage in the work of the core group on options for the establishment of a tribunal on the crime of aggression against Ukraine. In these difficult times, North Macedonia will continue to stand by Ukraine and its people, hopeful that reason will prevail and that life will be back to normal soon. Restoring peace should be an imperative. We remain fully engaged in providing support to these efforts and firmly believe that multilateralism should overcome militarism. I thank you so much.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Osmani for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.